I want to say good morning, but it's good afternoon. I'm shorter. This is a unique experience for me to be behind a podium. I'm usually out there. So, what's possible when journalists and public engagement practitioners work together? Kyle set us up for this conversation with a wonderful story of just that happening. And that's our focus. So those of you who came into this room hoping to learn how to get journalists to cover your work, frankly, I do hope you come away with some answers, but that they're different than you thought they were going to be. So in a moment, I will introduce the members of this panel, but it dawned on me after we did our workshop yesterday that it would be worthwhile to set some context for you about the world of journalism and what's going on. Before I do that, I want to say just a couple things of how I ended up here talking to you about this particular topic, because I have a foot in both worlds. I've been doing dialogic practice for more than 20 years, have 2 books out in the world on that, the Change Handbook, which I suspect many of you know, and then more recently Engaging Emergence, Turning Upheaval into Opportunity, which takes a complexity view into working with system change. And in 1999, because of what was at the time a very rare occurrence, a racially motivated shooting, I started thinking about the role of stories in the work that I did with appreciative inquiry at that time, and the effect of stories on worldview. And what I know is stories shape the way we see the world, and that shapes our behavior. And journalists are cultural storytellers. And I thought to myself, working with journalists would be a doorway in to creating a different kind of narrative, and reached out to some colleagues who were professional journalists, and in 2001, Journalism That Matters, which is now a 501c3 that focuses on convening conversations about reimagining the news and information ecosystem to support communities and democracy to thrive, was born. And so I have spent the last 16 years with a foot in each of these worlds. So a little bit of background on what's going on in the land of journalism. Just to give you some perspective, I'm sure that it comes as no surprise to anyone that journalism is an industry, a field in upheaval. And I often will use a quote from Meg Wheatley about the state of what's going on, which I think really hits the mark. She talks about hospicing the old and midwiving the new. And when I use that phrase with journalists, they get it. They recognize themselves in it. And so while much of legacy media is in a state of challenge, shall we say, there are some wonderful, vibrant, creative, innovative people who are really in the midst of reinventing journalism. And some of those folks are with us today. And so consider this a bit of midwiving as we make the connection between these two communities. And there are 2 ideas in particular that I believe are quite relevant to the D&D community. And the first is the notion of engagement. It is entering the language of journalism. And I can tell you, I was doing a happy dance when I started hearing that term coming out of the mouths of journalists just 2 or 3 years ago. And what has happened, it's a term that doesn't necessarily mean a lot to all journalists. For some, it's about eyeballs going after advertisers. But for some journalists, and definitely the ones that you will be hearing from today, engagement is about relationship. And it's as we see their work and what they're doing, we're seeing an evolution from thinking in terms of the audience as passive consumers of news to active, engaged uh, community members who are involved in their own lives. The other trend that I see happening that I think is relevant to this community has to do with the nature of storytelling itself. I think many of us know that when stories focus on what's broken, it tends to cause people to check out and to despair. And there is a counter trend that is being midwifed of telling stories that are multiple perspectives and possibility-oriented. And one particular example of that is an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network that has been working with a number of newsrooms across the country, and it changes the nature of the storytelling. I find these two trends are absolutely interwoven. If a community or if a news organization starts with engagement work, they very quickly find that the kinds of storytelling that they're doing needs to change. And if they start with that different kind of storytelling, it leads them into recognizing the need to listen more deeply to their community. So two very exciting trends. And they point to a third place that when I think about my own answer to that, what's possible, we've heard at NCDD over the last number of years the notion of civic infrastructure. Well, in most recent times, I begin to hear journalists talk about what does the 21st century public square look like, and what's our role in it? And I see this as just a really exciting area of potential overlap between these communities, because what I know is that when there is community conversation and when there is great storytelling, we have the beginnings of the alchemy of a new public square. So that's what I'll say by way of intro to this, and I'm now would like to invite these 5 journalists to come up, and as they're doing that, I'll tell you a bit of where we're going from here. I'm going to give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves, say just a little bit about their work, and I've also invited them because all but one of them have been with us this whole time. And so they're going to tell you some of their impressions of what it's been like to be here at this conference with D&D practitioners. So we'll hear briefly from each of them, and then we're going to turn to table conversations and give you a chance to reflect on what you're hearing. And from there, we'll go into a conversation in the room. So not traditional Q&A, but an exchange between what you're observing and what you're wondering about and their reflections on it. And then we'll end with a brief close. So that's the game plan. We'll see how it all falls out. So I want to begin by introducing Ellen Mayer, who's the community manager at Harkin. And Harkin is doing some of the most innovative audience engagement work in journalism today. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am that she's here with us to say a bit about that work. And frankly, I've been wanting to meet her for quite a while. So this conference was a great excuse for us to finally meet. So.
Thank you so much for that. That was lovely. My name is Ellen Mayer, and my background is actually in public radio. And I started my career, more or less, working at Chicago Public Radio, WBEZ, working on a radio show that was doing a new editorial model for journalism that involved audience input in the editorial decision-making process instead of engaging folks after the fact, in comments or with Facebook likes or whatever. And we did that by soliciting audience questions and creating news stories that satisfied and responded to those questions. And now in my job at Harkin, what we are doing is taking that model for journalism to other newsrooms around the country. And well, I'm sure sort of more details about how that works will sort of come up as we have this conversation, but what I wanted to talk about in terms of what I've taken away from all of you It's been such a wonderful experience. I've had a chance to talk to librarians. I love librarians, people who work in government, people who convene different kinds of civic dialogues, and I'm hearing a similar kind of challenge over and over again, which is a lot of people have a real resistance to opening up for civic dialogue, or hosting a community conversation, because they say, oh, it's going to be the same old suspects every time. It's going to be the people carrying the torches, and it's not going to be a positive conversation. And what's interesting is that it's the exact same issue in journalism. We have to get buy-in from newsrooms over and over again, because they say, we already hear from our audience in the comments, and they tell us we're doing a terrible job and that we can't please them, or it's trolls, and it's always terrible. And it's the same issue of only something like 20% of your readers and listeners are actually in the comments. So it's just those same old suspects. And what I've taken away from all of you is that is sort of reaffirming what we're trying to do at Hearken, which is that you have to design your interactions that allow for a different kind of experience, a more satisfying experience. So at Hearken, we designed a mode of interaction between the newsroom and its audience that was motivated by curiosity. And that's what allowed them to have a productive conversation. So I think the challenge for all of us is thinking about, okay, what other kinds of interactions can we design that will be motivated by different emotions, that will allow us to hear from different people and will allow for a more productive dialogue.
Thanks, Ellen. So I next want to introduce Chris Ferrone, who's a local guy. Yay. And I met Chris last year when Journalism That Matters convened a conversation on supporting independent journalism to thrive. And one thing I want you to know, that independent journalism is doing some of the most, they tend to work at the deep edges, very often uncovering stories that have really vital civic interest about them, and it is an unbelievably underfunded sector. And one of the things I learned about Chris at that session is he's really a just do it kind of guy. And he came home from that experience and started the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, BINGE. Interesting name. And with that, I turn it over to Chris.
Thank you very much, and it's true. Everything I'm about to tell you started in the wake of that, so thank you very much to Peggy for convening that amazing dialogue in and of itself. All right, so I'm also the editor of the Alt Weekly in Boston, Dig Boston. I teach communications at Salem State. I do a few things, but I've had a great time here this weekend, and I appreciate the invitation. And I want to introduce myself along the lines of some things that I, like verbatim almost, that I heard from at different panels I was at, to show just how much overlap there is between what I'm doing, what my team is doing, what a lot of journalists are doing, and what a lot of you are doing. So I heard there's not only a hunger to be heard, but there is a hunger to be engaged at a level we have not seen before. So this is where it comes in handy, because I come out of the alt media tradition. This is women writing about women's rights issues, African Americans writing about civil rights issues. The list goes on. Gay rights. So, I was at the Boston Phoenix before this, and of course, people pretend that the Village Voice started alt media. It's not true. This is, it's the idea is people, God forbid, people writing about things they know about. So another thing I heard, build on what is already happening. So that's what Binge is. Binge, instead of kind of starting a new outlet, our whole thing is in Boston, not necessarily the case in every city, there is a lot of great media infrastructure there. They just don't have anything extra. So we go to all sorts of outlets, and not just print ones, but certainly print ones, and say, what are your wish lists? What are some of the stories that you would do, and how can we facilitate you? Sometimes it's research and reporting and editing and fact checking. Sometimes they just need kind of a quarterback to see a team along, and certainly funding is always needed. Something else, I heard a ton about youth programs. For us, of course, always we want to have a conversation about diversity in journalism, as important as the conversation itself is, let's train young people in the media. So this is like critical to everything we do. We heard, so that we can tell the world our story, so this work could get out in the public. So I want to make sure that I say it before it's too late. I hope a lot of you realize how much media you're already making. You're not necessarily publishing it, but some of this stuff, like this is the era of the oral history. Everybody wants to know about everything. From like Reebok pump sneakers to I've done I did a whole one. I don't know how many hip hop fans did a whole one about Redman's episode of Cribs. Like people want to know about history and just about how things happen. So if you're convening people to talk about something, the recordings, you have podcasts there. You're creating so much media. I heard get the people where they already are, even if they're on those information cul-de-sacs. And that's why we are working with so many outlets. Instead of just having a new outlet saying, we can get, the same story or similar stories, or sometimes we'll do a big story, and then here's a sidebar for this neighborhood, see how it affects that community. And ultimately, what we do is we're really showing a lot of different communities how these issues are, touching all of them. Things like liquor licenses, things like gentrification. Let's see here. I really have enjoyed myself at this conference. I have so many notes. So I guess this is to end my introduction. Journalists are your friends. We can help, and I mean it, really. Oh, here's another quote. There's a need for media organizations that are tied to the community in a meaningful way. And I hate to be the one to tell you, but a lot of the times with your mainstream publications, that's just not what they're doing. I don't know. My advice is to not forget about the rest of us that are out there. Look, there are so many publications, community, neighborhood newspapers. They need content. They are desperate for it. Hopefully there's someone like Binge to kind of facilitate and coordinate that, but don't forget about the rest of us, your alternatives, et cetera.
So yeah, actually, if you would pass that to Linda. So next I want to introduce Linda Miller. And Linda, among her responsibilities, runs the Public Insight Network for American Public Media. And PIN was an early innovation in audience engagement. And the Public Insight Network and Linda has been a strong voice, an advocate for engagement in newsrooms for as long as I've known her. Which is 2008, when she attended a Journalism That Matters convening that brought together journalists and technologists to look at what's possible for communities and democracy to thrive when those two groups come together. And Linda reminded me we also had venture capitalists at that particular session. But I've valued her voice and passion around engagement since I've known her, and she is on the Journalism That Matters board.
Thanks, Peggy, and thanks to all of you and for the organizers of the conference. It's been really great. I think Peggy asked me to talk a little bit about initially sort of what is the Public Insight Network, what is PIN. And I have to tell you, I have many, many documents on my computer that have been rewritten since 2008 when I started this work about what is it, because everybody wants to know your elevator pitch and boil it down. And so PIN is a mindset, it is a tool set, it is a CRM for journalists, it is a way to connect curious journalists with knowledgeable sources, it is a way to build relationships and get away from extraction, transactional journalism, and I could go on. As a tool, basically, I will just say what we did is that we recognized at American Public Media, my predecessors there, Michael Scholar and Bill Busenberg and Bill Kling, recognized that these usual suspects that journalists often go to sort of are limiting our ability to report deeply on our communities, and there's insight all around us. Look around at your colleagues. You have experience and expertise, whether you recognize it or not just in dialogue and deliberation. And if we could find a way to tap into that, to democratize expertise, and to allow journalists to ask questions of knowledgeable sources, put it into a searchable, sortable, robust database, and then target more questions to those people. and then offer that platform to newsrooms around the country, we could build an amazing national network of sources. And we did. But what we did was we built a tool for journalists. And what I'm realizing is that what we actually have is a tool for community. But we put a lot of rules and structure around it, and now we're trying to figure out how to reimagine it. This conference, wow, so many gifts coming here. I want to put it in the context of a little bit about impact. Because believe it or not, media organizations do think about impact, the impact we want to have. We've developed frameworks for measuring it. Ours is, how did this help you to think differently about something, an issue? How did it help you to relate to people in your community differently? And what, if at all, has this motivated you to do to help your community? So one thing that has made me think differently is that when I met Peggy and Stephen Silha and folks like this who practice dialogue and deliberation, Peggy seemed like a unicorn to me, right? And I've come here and it's like, Peggy's not a unicorn. Right, this is amazing. It's amazing people who do this. And I'll come back to that idea of unicorn maybe later on the panel. Another gift I got here is I got a better elevator pitch. This is a big takeaway for me. Page 6 of the guide, the conference guide, in the description of the civic science approach workshop. What I do is I help to build dialogue that respects diverse beliefs and inspires curiosity and empathy. That's my new elevator pitch. So there's a connection there in what we do. I would say in relationship building, I've met several people who, it's not just that we share a common interest or a common purpose, it's what we can do together that is differently. And I will say that, so I'm relating to you all differently, but in terms of community impact, what I might do in terms of action, I'm not going to give it away, but I will just say I have 2 amazing ideas from meeting people here that when we leave this conference, we're going to work on together.
Nothing like a little mystery. So next I'd like to introduce Krista Case Bryant. And Krista and I are meeting for the first time as we get ready for this panel. She's with the Christian Science Monitor. And one of the things that excites me is, one, to have someone here from a legacy newspaper and who is doing pretty amazing work. And as a matter of fact, the Monitor has expressed interest in hearing D&D kinds of stories. So there's a set of ears that are definitely ripe and interested in knowing more about the work going on in this room. And I felt good when I heard that she was coming because my partner at Forming Journalism That Matters, Stephen Silha, worked for the Monitor for quite a number of years. And what he has always said to me about it, and it's a deep history that still applies. The Monitor, as a news organization, tends to be future-oriented, solutions-oriented, and looks at underlying causes, not just symptoms. So, Krista, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank all of you. I regret that I wasn't able to be here until today because we have such a small politics department. Someone had to keep the paper going. But my colleague, Mark Sappenfield, was here on Friday, and I know he really enjoyed that, so thanks from him to you. And thank you for the really important work that you're doing. I think we're approaching a moment as a country that's we just need so much national reconciliation no matter which way the election goes, and the work that you've been doing for years and years, I'm sure, will be a tremendous resource for your communities come November 10th. And that's something that we at the Monitor are thinking a lot about, is what is the role that we can play in helping bring about that kind of national reconciliation. We were founded a little over 100 years ago by a New England woman named Mary Baker Eddy, and she gave the paper, she said in her first editorial in the first edition of the paper, she said, "The object of the Monitor is to injure no man, but to bless all mankind." And that's a pretty extraordinary mission for a journalistic outlet, especially for me to think about as politics editor. This is something I just came to this summer, and we're in the middle of this terrifically hard-fought campaign with not so much civility or dignity or blessing. And how can the Monitor come into that environment and do some good? And what we've done is come up with a special election series which runs once a week, and we're taking some of the most polarizing issues facing our country and trying to find creative ways to write about them that will get people on both sides of the issue. Of course, there's more than both sides, but a range of perspectives to think about some of these things in a new way. So for example, our first edition was about guns, and we had someone who was a big-time gun owner, had his own shooting range, his own Second Amendment plaque with his cannons from the Civil War, and he has a gun shop and everything, and yet he found out, this man lives in New Hampshire, that 3 people committed suicide in the same week with guns purchased from his shop. And that really led to a real change of heart for him, and he decided, against the wishes of a lot of people in his sort of gun rights tribe, to work with gun safety folks and try to find a way to cut down on the number of gun suicides, which it turns out cause way more deaths than mass shootings. And so that was a really interesting way of getting at that issue, and we've done other ones on race and Muslim refugees and national security, immigration's coming up this week, so all sorts of things. And we've had partners in allsides.com. I know John Gable is here, and also Living Room Conversations, to try to inspire people through the packages that we put together each week to take these into smaller forum discussions. And our hope is that they will learn to have more understanding of each side, if not respect and empathy. And so we're just sort of at the beginning of what Harkin's been doing for a long time, and other folks, and really interested in hearing how these things are working in other places. Like I know Mark went to the Gary, Indiana civility panel on Friday and really appreciated hearing about that project. It was great hearing from Kyle about the Akron Civility Initiative. And so we're definitely really interested in those stories and hoping to be able to be a bigger part of telling them and helping the whole country hear about that.
Thank you. So one last person I want to introduce, and that's Michelle Ferrier, who is bringing us a view from the academy. She's at the journalism school in Ohio University. I always mix up whether it's University of Ohio or Ohio University. Ohio University in Athens. And she brings an emphasis on media entrepreneurship and serving underserved communities to the work that she does. And like Linda, I met Michelle at that same Silicon Valley convening that we did, and she knocked my socks off. And we began working together and have been ever since. And at this stage, Michelle is the president of the Journalism That Matters board.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to NCDD leadership and your community for being so welcoming and providing a forum for this kind of conversation, which I find to be very urgent. And so thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here today. As Peggy said, I am a professor at Ohio University, but I'm also a recovering journalist. I have been in legacy media as a columnist, and in the early 2000s actually turned my attention to online communities. As we were developing online commenting systems, I began to think about a different way that we might be able to use virtual tools to be able to engage our audiences differently, and developed an online community platform that was separate from our news platform as a way for the community to tell their own stories through the ugly term we call user-generated content. From that work, though, and the development of that platform, I came to that work with a different sensibility, which was to design an online community that honored the knowledge and stories of the individuals that lived in that community. And that was an intentional design from my work to be able to connect what I was doing as a journalist more deeply to my passion for making change in my communities. And that comes from my position as a person of color, that has been marginalized in our legacy media. Populations of people of color have been disenfranchised from our media system. And so fighting from in it as well as outside of it, my career has allowed me to be able to come to this space of understanding that we need a new type of journalism and a new set of practices to be able to do our work in this age. My doctoral research is around digital identity and reputation management, which sounds a little odd. But I think about how I came to the question. I wasn't thinking about going back to school. But I came to the question because I'd moved to a rural community on the other end of Appalachia from Ohio and Virginia, and found myself at a loss to try and connect myself to the people in the community and the issues that I was passionate about. And so I went into my education with the question, how can I create structures for dialogue and conversation that allow me to be able to see the assets in my community, the people that are there, and the knowledge that they bring, honor it, and bring that to the forefront for conversation, storytelling, and action in our communities. And from that work, sought out opportunities through Journalism That Matters and other places to find like practitioners. Well, in those 8 years, I think, I call myself the two-headed editor. I think I'm the two-headed facilitator, and that Peggy sits on my shoulder much of the work that I've done over the past 8 years. And she's introduced me to practices of dialogue and deliberation that have deepened my appreciation for dialogue, appreciation for the types of techniques that you use to move people to action, and to understand how we might be able to incorporate those skills either into the work of journalists or to help you reimagine a news and information ecosystem that is by and for the community, and perhaps different from the journalistic structures that we've had to date in our country. So my work has always been at the edges of disciplines. Sometimes I laugh that the only thing in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead skunks, and I'm not quite sure which one I am today. But that opportunity to really be here with you all and see the kinds of ways that your practices intersect with what we do as journalists, where our practices, your practices begin, our practices begin and end, and how we might be able to work together, I think is a real critical opportunity right now, because we need to have a much more inclusive journalism system that represents all of us in our diversity and our beauty, and also helps us move forward together towards the visions we'd like to see realized.
Thank you. And I think Michelle just actually set us up with the question for your tables. So you've just had a little bit of appetizer, and hopefully it's had enough spice in it, because innovation occurs at the intersection of unexpected things. So I hope bringing journalists together with you sets us up for some surprising insights. So we'll take about 15, 20 minutes. I'll give you a 2-minute heads up, and invite you at your tables to have the conversation about what's possible when these two tribes meet. Oh, and I should say, these folks are going to step down and join some of the tables and be in the conversations with you.
This is sort of a koan from what we got, but it would be sort of deliberation is long and the news is short. And what it means is the news has to come out every day, and the deliberation stretches on in a way that makes it harder to cover.
Thank you. And there are a couple mics up there, so if anyone feels inspired to respond, and we lost somebody. Okay, Linda. So
I want to repeat something that somebody at the table said and then add a little bit to it, is that in order for people to collaborate and have dialogue, they need to see success stories. They need to see success stories of people doing that successfully, and a lot of what's done in here are wonderful stories that nobody sees. The other part that I recognized was that I heard from that was in dialogue and deliberation, a lot of it's about establishing trust. And the biggest problem, according to Pew Research, that journalism has right now is it's not trusted. So it seems to me that if you can bring those two things together and have an opportunity to show success stories and show trust in a dialogue in a way that people can see it online, that would also bring more trust to the news service as truly showing, and okay, here's my plug, all sides of what's going on.
Hey, Peggy, I'd like to speak to that. You're absolutely right. At the heart of what you do is trust. And yet, as I say in many forums, in many underserved and underrepresented communities, and especially in communities of color, journalists are equivalent to the police. That the language that we've used, the stories that we've told, have done more damage to those communities than helping them heal or move forward. And so our work as journalists really needs to deepen and understand how language, how word choice, how our story selection, and our engagement with community has to be radically different to be inclusive in a way that serves that community, that feeds that community, and that helps it to grow. And if our mission only stays on covering and reporting rather than being integral to a communication system that helps that community to thrive, then I think, as Peggy said, we are hospicing an industry that's in decline because it has lost that trust and connection to the geographic communities that they've been centered in.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up real quick? I'm not trying to put myself out of the job here, but I think I hope that one thing that people get out of this is that you have to make a lot of your own media, and I think that just cut us out of the equation. People trust you. I heard about that. I'm sorry, the legend in your field yesterday. They were talking about who walked the messages back and forth at Camp David. I'm thinking you got to trust that dude because he could just change the message, right? So people trust you. You should be that. You should facilitate that communication.
And that brings up a question that I asked one of the tables, and I'd love to hear from others on this, is what are you looking for from journalists? Is it mainly like as a megaphone to get your message out to a broader audience, or is there some sort of skill set there? Because you all seem like very skilled communicators. So is there something that the media can contribute on top of that, or is it mainly about just amplifying what you're talking about? Because I think a challenge on the journalist side is for decades, the role of a journalist, the skill of a journalist was in sifting through everything that's happening in society, the key ideas, the key trends in thought, and bringing those to the attention of readers and doing it in a way that was intentionally and supposed to be, in a positive sense, discriminatory. I mean, not discriminatory against people, but to be discriminating in what is worth readers' time to hear about, and to be something of a thought leader. And I think there's been a big pushback against that. And it's obvious there's so many wonderful, thoughtful people across all sectors of society, and who is the media to think they should be the ones leading the conversation? But then if you go to the other end of the spectrum, it's kind of like, well, are we just here to give everybody a microphone? And then that doesn't actually help either, because you have this cacophony of voices. So what sort of skill set or leadership role are you looking for the media to play, if any?
So now we have lots of hands. I love it. We know something's changed when it's the people on the stage asking questions of the people in the room. So over here, and then to Barb, and then over here.
The gentleman to my, who is not a plant, but anyway, was saying that perhaps journalism traditionally has been considered a priesthood. And so maybe you've heard that term before. But this is something that's not just the institution of the news media, but also of government and other institutions that are finding a hard time adapting to the fact that they used to be the authority figures or the providers of service, and did not have to listen to the little people out there. It was, here's the story, and that's the way, Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is, And it was good, but then after, for whatever reasons, technology probably being part of it, people say, hey, I have a voice, I want my story to get out there. And so you're having the kids are growing up, so to speak, and now the parents have to adapt to the fact that they're turning into grown-ups and they don't want to be, so you could say the term is, I guess, the people formerly known as the audience. And so this is painful for in both relationships, and so that the idea is like, how do we collaborate about collaborating? So.
Thank you. And people formerly known as the audience is Jay Rosen.
So what do we want from you? I can answer that on kind of two levels. First, we need you to tell our stories. Mark Gerson said it very well. What we need is we need money and we need media. We have a country that's starving for people who know how to bring people across the divides. We know how to do it. It's like we're hidden under a blanket. And there's a narrative out there that America can't get along. And yet you've been in our meetings and you've heard story after story of how we're actually making that happen. So yes, that is part of it. We need you to partner with us and help get that the alternative narrative told. The other side of it is, I have this other part of me that once upon a time worked with a guy named Joe Bergantino when he was starting the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. I love how reporters, especially investigative reporters, don't know how to make allegiance with anyone because they might owe them something. And Joe was trying to build an organization, so we partnered and I was helping him do it. As part of that, they did digital journalism, and they really went looking through federal records, and they unearthed the whole story about rape on campuses. And that has had a huge change in terms of getting that issue. And only investigative journalists could have done that. So the other thing we need from you is that kind of fact-based, documented, really good, bringing the light on it. So we've got that when we bring it into a community conversation. So we need both of those things from you.
I just want to jump in here a quick second, and not to, take too far away from what you were saying too, but I think what I'm hearing, and this is not a criticism, it's just a reality, is just how hard it is for us to break out of our mindset to rethink our relationship with one another. So despite our best efforts of asking you all to reimagine what you might do with media and journalists, if we all shared the same purpose, our conversation keeps kind of circling back to a theme. We need you to tell our story. We need you to come to our events and cover them. And it's really hard to break out of that thinking. And I think we started to do it at our table over here around some issues, and it really was, Tim, I'm gonna sort of talked about, I said, what does the conversation sound like if you go to the Pittsburgh Gazette and you say, we want to partner with you? We know our community has some problems and some information needs, and what might we do together? And I said, I'm with you, 100%. Let's talk. He said he wants an organization-to-organization conversation. And we started to talk about how that conversation is different. And it is like, I want, Tim, maybe I should just let you talk about what you talked about, how we talk about both the resources we bring to the table and what we might do together that we can't do separate. But then also the question came up, but are you going to send a reporter to cover the event? So it's really hard. It's really hard for us to shake out of our thinking, but I want you to know, like, that's our challenge. Our challenge is to think that we have the common purpose, which is to create thriving communities and to encourage you to have those conversations in a new mindset, and as hard as it is to not ask them to send a reporter to cover the event. Completely throw that idea out the window. They might say, this is amazing, we should write about it, but maybe that isn't the best way to actually make change in your community. Maybe the best way, I think one of the ideas to come out of our table was, be really great if you could sort of disseminate the baseline information that we need people who might come to one of our events to have before they show up. That's meeting an information need, and it does not involve sending a reporter to cover your story. It's, could you just publish this? Could you put this online for anyone who might come to our event? So I just want to just bring the sort of idea of like creative new ways of thinking about our relationship.
And I wanted to add to that because I think there's a misconception in the room here. And I want to point out some of that challenge and assumption that we have here. I'm the principal investigator for a research project called Media Deserts Project that maps the reach and penetration of news organizations across the US. And if you look at that mapping, we see heavy concentrations of media on the West and East Coast, obviously tracking with our density of population. So what we've seen happen since 2007 is a contraction of that reach. Newspapers, as they've struggled to try and maintain themselves, tightening their borders, so pulling in the bureaus that they used to have in a more dispersed way to their core. But what we also see is a lack of penetration in communities. So those newspapers are only going to 10% or 20% of the people in the communities in which they exist. And so I think the assumption is that the media has much more power and authority in your geographic locations than they may actually have. And that creates an opportunity for you. And I think as an organization and as dialogic practitioners, you have to think, well, gosh, if only 10% of the people are reading the newspaper, how important is it, or what is it that I want to communicate with that 10%? And then how do I engage the other 90% in the work that I'd like to do?
That's something that we're doing even as an outlet. I mean, so I'll just throw a couple things at you. We're doing a housing series, and we're going to be doing a lot of projected infographics, like giant projections on the sides of buildings. I told a few of you this weekend how we're doing we use the term evergreen in journalism, kind of material that is good for a long time. We're doing how do we get in front of people? Diner mats. So any diner will take free placemats. Any bar, independent bar, will take free coasters. Great way to get information across. I could go on and on. We're doing carnival games. We have done coffee sleeves. So these are the ideas. So we're in the same boat as you, but really, you can really bypass the media a lot of this. And the conversation I had with my table was about what's needed, and there's certainly a journalistic skill set. How do you curate the material that you're all generating anyway? And I just want to say one more thing, because I don't get the chance. It's like, as an editor, I love this stuff. Think about, maybe you have to think of the stuff you're doing in sleazier headline terms for some reason. Like, we got these two people who generally would cut each other's heads off in the room together for 10 minutes, and here's the 10 coolest things they said. It's not necessarily have to pitch it, but some of the things you have is cool. It's juicy. People want to read it, believe me.
BuzzFeedify. Totally. Do it. I also wanted to say, I was in, with some of you yesterday, I was in the session that Peggy kind of convened that was on a similar topic. And I heard a lot of people say, I want the press to cover my thing. But I also heard a lot of people say the underlying desire for that, which is that I want the press to pay attention to not just conflict. I want, right? That's a big issue here, right? And that it's still, the press doesn't like to be told what to do, unfortunately. That's a big problem that I have in my job, is trying to get newsrooms to let the audience tell them what to do in a certain sense. But there is some movement in some corners of the journalism world to rethink what is actually newsworthy. And if you go to a journalism school and you sit in a class, they'll give you, it depends, the discipline and the school, they'll give you 5 to 7 values that each student is supposed to meet, to sort of check off in a list in terms of how do I decide if this story is newsworthy. And one of the top values is there conflict? That's how they're choosing what to cover, is there conflict? And maybe that's wrong, maybe that's not the only way that we should be telling stories. So what I want to encourage you all to do is find the people in journalism, and they exist, who are starting to rethink what is newsworthy and what does our audience actually need from us, and see if you can partner with those people. See if you can say, let's get together. They might not every newsroom, for example, is going to be as receptive as the Northwest Indiana Times is to the idea of a civility program, but you might pose it somehow, in some other way. How can we, come up with an initiative with some news organizations in this region or in this town to figure out what are some other kinds of stories that we can tell that don't just focus around conflict, that still tell the truth, that still are informing on meaty issues that we all care about, but are telling the story in a way that is not just about these people are angry at each other, or this is violence, or it bleeds, it leads.
So there are so many hands, and we have, we're just close to wrap. I promised the mic to Tom, and then the woman in green, and then we're going to wrap it and leave some time for some very brief closing remarks.
Now for something a little different. I believe that dialogue, reporting and dialogue can be a powerful sandwich. And I think that there's an opportunity to collaborate here. If we were to turn to our communities and engage coffee shops, we're thinking the Starbucks dialogues, and say, we'll host a dialogue, facilitate a dialogue, that means we're anticipating that the media will write a story that's appropriate for that type of a dialogue. If there's a way to bring that type of a conversation into the community, it gets investigative journalism that doesn't penetrate to the streets talked about at the streets.
I'm sorry, I have to jump in here. Can I just build on that? Or what if you invited the news organization to come sit at the coffee table and create a listening post instead of to come pay attention to what you're doing and write about it, but what if they were actually there to listen too? And let them have that discovery of finding stories and telling them, and not just write about the fact that you're having coffee conversations. What if they're part of it? And I think you'll find a lot more willingness to do this, because we need creative ways to build audience and to reach people. We have many of the same goals that you have, and some of the same things keep us up at night. So just keep reiterating on your ideas and thinking, or we could do this.
So one last comment, and then we'll be doing some close.
I just wanted to address the question of, what skill set does the journalism community bring that could help us? And I think you have probably a much better skill set than we do at what makes this work accessible to the viewer, to the reader, to the spectator, which, if worked up front may even influence the format in which some of this work is done, but certainly even at the back end, how would you take the stuff we do and make it fun to watch, interesting, revelationary? That's not stuff that we've given enough thought to, but we do want the world to get excited about it and to watch it, but that's your skill set more than ours.
Thank you.
Thank you. So before we shift gears a little bit, I mean, the pent-up desire for this conversation is very clear. And so I have an invitation for you. In last October, Journalism That Matters co-hosted a convening in Portland, Oregon with the Agora Journalism Center. And we're doing it again in May. And our question last year was, how can journalists and the public engage to support communities and democracy to thrive? It will be some variation on that this coming year. Come. And we have, as you can see, we have 3 board members from Journalism That Matters present, because we don't see this as just about doing a panel here. I believe this is the beginning of a conversation, of something that matters to all of us. So Bill Densmore, one of our other board members here, had something he wanted to say about the conference.
Well, I just wanted to emphasize that what I've been hearing about in the last 2 days that I've been here, and this has been a real epiphany for me, really, is that everybody's talking about wanting to rethink the relationship with media. And we're talking about rethinking what's newsworthy. And we're talking about trying to figure out how we leverage the dialogue and deliberation expertise in the room here and figure out a way to partner with media to heal the wounds in civil society that are opened by this political season, for example. Believe us, we want to have that conversation with our fellow journalists in Portland in May. And we are not, as you are, we are not a well-heeled organization. But we certainly, if you let us know that you want to come, we'll try to figure out a way to make it physically, financially possible for you to come.
Oregon.
Portland.
So kind of board member of this organization to board member of that, we accept the invitation. We very much wanted this conversation to open. And I just want to go back to the framing of the conference, to go back to this issue of conflict and those organizations who are going to do news that's not about conflict. And I respectfully raise that the conflict that we've been addressing the entire time is that there is a mainstream narrative out there that we cannot get along. And we think the conflicting narrative is the truth we tell, which is, yes, we can, and we're doing it all the time. And that's what we mean about, we hope you'll tell that story too, because not to tell it is not to be telling both sides of what's true in America. Thanks for being here very much.
So I have a question. Do we want to end on that note or hear? I mean, that was a great note to end on. Would you each like to? Looks like it. So how about a brief closing reflection from each of these folks? And I really want the room to have the last word. So I'm going to ask you to be brief so that we have some time for really one word kind of close from the room.
Yeah, I just want to kind of jump off of what Linda already said, which is that I work with newsrooms, 50 of them and counting, who are trying to do more engagement all the time. And specifically, there's a lot of talk about we need to be having more events. If we just did we poured all of this money and resource and time into a big investigation, we blew something up, and how do we get it in front of more people and get them talking about it? Everybody wants to do that in journalism right now. But you guys are the ones who know how to get people talking. And newsrooms don't always have the money and the staff and the infrastructure to plan an event by themselves and put it on and figure out how to moderate it. And that's where you can come and say, this is what we can offer. And then, chances are, like if it's a radio station, and that's not just that they, will send a reporter to cover it, but they will, like Linda said, find stories from that conversation that they'll want to tell. So that's, I really think, the key to this partnership, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I don't want to bring a sour note. I just think that you're not going to get to a lot of media. So my message is one of empowerment. Make your own media and stop thinking about it as PR. Start thinking about it as storytelling. I've seen some unbelievable examples, the most powerful being with eviction stories. There was no need for the whole media to be involved. Just telling those stories was enough.
Thank you.
I'm thinking of really the importance of this work. My target is history, and newspapers are typically the first draft of history. And if the stories of people like me and others are not told, if the stories of our communities and our individuals aren't told, we're doomed to repeat that history over and over and over again. And so until we create a system where those counter-narratives can rise to the surface, where we can bring all of that to bear, we are not going to be able to get that historical traction to be able to move forward.
Thank you.
So my hope is that we'll change the narrative from why don't you to how could we? And I would also hope that stories like you heard from Kyle and Ellen and everyone and Chris and everyone up here and all of that you do not see these as unicorns. Just like people are having conversations and getting along, this kind of journalism is incubated and happening everywhere. We are not anomalies. Harkin is in 60 newsrooms. PIN is in 70 newsrooms. People are hungry for this, and therefore we are more focused on meeting these needs. And so just like I said Peggy I thought was a unicorn, instead of a unicorn, I hope you'll see this as that game Slugbug, where you see a Volkswagen, and now everywhere you look, there's a Volkswagen. That is what is happening in journalism. It is positive. Seize on it, and let's work together.
Just two things to answer the flip side of my question about what can journalists offer. I think two things that you as a community can offer to journalists and that will help further your work, but maybe not in the exact immediate direct way that you often think, is one, you have incredible insight into issues that you're dealing with every day. And so maybe thinking not only in terms of inviting the media to certain events that you're doing, but also, hey, we've been doing these sort of civic dialogue conversations for 5 years, and the thing we keep running up against in our particular community is X. This is something that really needs to be resolved, and we just thought you as a local newspaper might want to know that and do an in-depth series on it. We could, I suggest you talk to this person, this person, this person. And so to think of yourself not just as a subject, but a source, because that makes, just as journalists are looking to create relationships with their audience, I think you can be looking to create relationships with media, and that will further your goals in more ways than one. And the other one is, like Ellen was saying, I mean, when I was in Jerusalem for 3 years, I felt like this place is not at all represented in what you read about back home. I mean, yes, people have been fighting here for a really long time, but to say the Middle East is all about like terrorists who want to kill each other and always have for like 3,000 years is kind of a overstate. I mean, like it's missing a huge swath of what's happening here and incredible hospitality and resilience and strength. So I started a blog called The Olive Press, Finding Humanity Amid the Pressures of the Middle East. Not about conflict, it's about finding humanity within the conflict. But it was so hard to get that out there and to find people who wanted to read it. And that's where you guys come in. You have an incredible resource of networked people who are thoughtful and respectful and interested in really engaging on a deep level and might actually be the kind of people who would click on that story instead of like Britney Spears' latest tribulations or whatever. So to be able to present yourself as someone who can provide a network of readers to engage with that material and to suggest thoughtful stories and to share it with their friends, that is a huge, huge asset in journalism, especially at a time when we don't have huge marketing budgets. So those are just 2 ideas for strengthening your relationship for the media. Thank you all for your contributions.
So before we give them a round of applause, turn to someone next to you and give them a one-word reflection that you have. Exchange that. We'll do a round of applause and turn this back over to John. So. So I've heard spillover and eye-opening. And I want to personally thank my old friends and new friends up on the stage and ask you to join me in giving them a round of applause.